Welcome to Reform Thinking. I am your host, and I am genuinely glad you have tuned in.
It's good to be here.
We are dedicating this session to digging into the archives of theological history, but with a very specific lens. We aren't here to just memorize dates or, recite biographies. We are looking for the substantial, the heavy concepts that actually shift the center of gravity in how we view God and the world.
And that's a good way to put it, a shift in the center of gravity. Because we aren't skimming the surface today. We are tackling a figure who looms absolutely massive over Protestant history.
Right.
And yet, he's a man who is often, and I mean very often, misunderstood. We're here to help parse some of the more complex theological concepts that defined his life and hopefully apply them to ours.
And our focus, the source material we're looking at, is a seminal message delivered by John Piper. This was back in 1988 at the Bethlehem Conference for Pastors.
That's right.
The title of the message was The Pastor is Theologian, Life and Ministry of Jonathan Edwards. Now, for you, the listener, who might be prepping for a meeting, driving to work, or just trying to get a better grasp of church history, I want to be clear.
Yeah.
This isn't just a biography. It's a look at how intellectual rigor and pastoral care intersect. It is about the life of the mind and the state of the soul.
That intersection is the critical piece. It really is. Piper's address points out that you cannot separate the mind from the heart in the life of Edwards. The source material we have in front of us is essentially a call to look past the cartoons and caricatures of Jonathan Edwards.
The cartoons, yeah.
And understand what Piper calls a God-entranced worldview.
And that's really the mission of this deep dive. That's the goal. We want to see how that specific worldview, being God-entranced, shapes ministry and, well, the whole of the Christian life.
And we should note right at the outset, just for the sake of clarity, that this discussion is grounded in Reformed theology. We are adhering to the Westminster Confession's focus on God's sovereignty, which is something Edwards championed, ferociously. This isn't just about a man. It's about the theology that drove the man. We are looking at this through the lens of high sovereignty and deep depravity.
Okay, so let's unpack this. When most people hear the name Jonathan Edwards, especially if they went to a public high school in America, they have a very specific and usually very negative image in mind.
Oh, yes.
The source material refers to this as the high school history textbook version of Edwards. And I remember reading it myself.
Yes, the caricature. It's pervasive. It's the cultural default setting for him. It's almost all anyone knows, if they know anything at all.
And the perception is usually of this gloomy, sullen, morose man, the guy in the black coat scowling.
The fun killer.
Exactly. And if you read the standard textbook summary, Edwards is often reduced to a single paragraph. He usually says something like, the Great Awakening was a brief period of religious intensity in the 1730s that caused a lot of church splits.
Right, and he's the guy to blame.
He's painted as the ringleader of that trouble. He's the villain in the story of rational progress, the guy holding back the Enlightenment.
It's a reductionist view, certainly. It's super simplified. And the centerpiece of that reduction is almost always that one famous sermon. You know the one.
Sinners in the hands of an angry God.
There it is.
You legitimately cannot talk about Edwards without that coming up. The imagery is just so vivid it burns into your brain.
It's designed to be.
The source describes it perfectly. God holding a sinner over the pit of hell, much like one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over a fire.
The spider image, that's what sticks.
The language is intense. It says God abhors the sinner and that the sinner is worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. It's hard to hear.
It is terrifying language. There's no getting around that. And because it's so graphic, it's easy to dismiss Edwards as a pathological misanthrope if you stop there.
Right, if that's all you know.
If that's the only data point you have, you assume he was a man who delighted in being morbid or who's trying to scare people for sport, a kind of sadistic rhetorical exercise.
Like he was just trying to be mean-spirited or emotionally abusive. But Piper argues in our source material that this misses the point entirely. In fact, it misses the motive.
It does. It misses the why. We have to pivot to the reason behind that language. This is where we need to put on our theological thinking caps for a second. Edwards was not being morbid. He was laboring to communicate a biblical reality that he believed was objectively true. He was looking at texts like Revelation 19.14.
I have that reference here. Christ will tread the winepress of the fierceness of the wrath of God the Almighty.
Say it again.
The fierceness of the wrath of God the Almighty.
That is a heavy combination of words. Fierceness, wrath, almighty.
Yeah, that's a pileup of intensity.
So look at the reaction Edwards had to that text. He wasn't rubbing his hands together in glee. He was stunned. He was awed. He noted that the phrase fierceness and wrath implies something infinitely dreadful.
So he's responding to the Bible, not inventing something from his own morbid mind.
Precisely. He wasn't inventing these horrors to control people. He was trying to find language that could match what he saw in Scripture. He felt a burden to be accurate to the text.
Piper makes a really interesting comparison here between Edwards and modern preachers. It's a sharp contrast.
It is.
He points out that Edwards struggled to find images shocking enough to match the biblical reality of hell. He felt language failed him because it was too weak.
Whereas modern preachers often do the exact opposite. We search for language that is weak enough.
Right. Piper says contemporary preachers tend to use abstractions and circumlocutions. We try to move away from concrete pictures of fire and gnashing teeth because they're uncomfortable.
We want to soften the blow. We say separation from God instead of fire, which is true, but it's not the whole picture the Bible paints.
And this leads to a diagnostic question that Piper poses, which I think is brilliant and arguably the most pointed question for us to answer regarding this sermon. Why the difference? Why did Edwards struggle to find scary enough images while we struggle to make them less scary?
And Piper suggests the answer is simple, though, uncomfortable.
What's the answer?
Edwards actually believed in hell.
Oof. That stings a bit.
It should. It's meant to. He felt the weight of it. Many contemporaries perhaps do not feel that way, even if they profess the doctrine on paper.
It's the difference between a theoretical danger and a real one.
That's it.
If you really believed a bus was coming at someone, you wouldn't whisper a warning. You would scream. You wouldn't worry about your tone being too harsh.
Precisely. The spider sermon wasn't hate. It was love. It was a desperate warning born out of a deep conviction about reality. But if we only focus on that, if we stop at the spider, we miss the full scope of the man. And frankly, we miss the genius.
And the credentials list in the source material is staggering.
Yeah.
I mean, it's easy to forget this when you're just thinking about the one sermon.
The man was an intellectual giant.
Edwards is cited by both secular and evangelical historians as the greatest Protestant thinker America has ever produced. Not just the best preacher, the best thinker.
His intellect was formidable. He was operating on a level that most of us can barely track with, let alone replicate.
He wrote The Freedom of the Will, which is this incredibly insightful work on sovereignty and accountability. It's still debated in philosophy departments today.
Still a standard text.
Then there's The Religious Affections, which I found fascinating because it's a critique of the very revival he helped spark.
That's a critical point that often gets lost in the wild revivalist narrative. He wasn't just a cheerleader for the Great Awakening, he was its most penetrating analyst.
So he wasn't just caught up in the emotion of it all?
No, far from it. He saw the emotionalism, the fainting, the crying out, and he used his theological precision to separate true spiritual fruit from mere religious excitement. He was trying to figure out what was from God and what was just, human hype.
He was cutting out the cancer while trying to save the patient.
A very good way of putting it.
And we cannot forget his domestic life. The caricature of the angry loner just falls apart when you look at the reality. He was a pastor for 23 years.
23 years in one church.
A father of 11 faithful children, and later a missionary to the Native Americans. This wasn't some disconnected academic in an ivory tower.
And he did all of this without modern conveniences. No electric light, no word processors, no antibiotics. He lived a life of rigorous, constant labor. But there's another aspect of his legacy that often gets overlooked, especially when people are just focused on his fire and brimstone reputation.
You're referring to his impact on missions? This is one of the most surprising parts of the source material for me.
It is surprising for most people.
You don't usually hear Jonathan Edwards and think global missions movement. You think Puritan, Calvinist, New England.
Cold, intellectual New England.
But Piper makes a strong case that it wasn't just his theology that fueled missions, but a biography he wrote.
The Life of David Brainerd.
Yes. Edwards edited and published the diary of David Brainerd. Brainerd was a young missionary to the Native Americans who actually died in Edwards' house.
It's a tragic but powerful story. Brainerd died of tuberculosis, or consumption as they called it then. It was a messy, painful death.
Just a heartbreaking situation.
And to add to the tragedy, Edward's daughter, Jerusha, was nursing him. She contracted the disease from him and died shortly after. It was a house of mourning, a house of deep grief.
That is incredibly heavy. Yet Edwards took Brainerd's private journals, the wrestling of his soul, his depression, his zeal, and published them.
And the impact of that one book is what Piper calls a roll call of missionary history.
Yeah.
The effect was just Massive.
It really is. It became the handbook for self-sacrifice in missions. Take Gideon Hawley, for instance. He was a missionary protege of Edwards.
Okay.
He carried that book in his saddlebags as he rode through the wilderness. In 1753, Hawley wrote that when the strain was almost beyond endurance, he needed something more than human support. He said he read his Bible and Mr. Brainerd's life, and they were the only things that kept him going.
Wow.
That's high praise, to put a biography right next to the Bible in your saddlebag.
That's about as high as it gets. And it wasn't just Calvinists who were moved by it. John Wesley,
The father of modern Methodism.
who definitely disagreed with Edwards on predestination and the specific points of Calvinism, actually published a shortened version of Brainerd's life.
He edited it himself.
He did, and he told his preachers to emulate Brainerd's spirit. He essentially said, ignore the theology if you must, but catch the fire. He saw the devotion, the absolute sold-outness of Brainerd.
It crossed theological lines. Then you have William Carey, the father of modern missions, Henry Martyn, Robert Morrison, David Livingstone, Andrew Murray. These are giants of the faith,
All of them.
and they all point back to this biography as a primary influence.
Even into the 20th century, there's a note here about Jim Elliot. He was one of the missionaries martyred by the Auca Indians, now known as the Wodani in Ecuador in the 1950s.
A famous story of modern missions.
In his diary, Elliot wrote that Brainerd's life convicted him of pride. He saw Brainerd suffering and realized his own dedication fell short. It spurred him on.
It shows that Edwards is the fuel behind 250 years of missionary movement. It's an unbroken chain.
It really is.
Yet the man himself remains largely unknown to the average Christian, or at least the real version of him does. It seems like Edwards understood that theology leads to mission, and mission runs on prayer.
That's a great summary. And that brings us back to the core concept Piper wants to drive home. All of this, the preaching, the writing, the missions, it all flows from one source.
Right.
It's what he calls the God-entranced worldview.
This section of the source material starts with a heavy quote from the historian Mark Knoll. He says that American evangelicals ceased thinking about life from the ground up as Christians.
That's the tragedy of lost perspective. Knoll argues that after Edwards, the American church split. His piety went to the revivalists, the people who focused on emotion and conversion experiences.
Okay, the heart people.
And his theology went to the academics, the people in the seminaries arguing about doctrine.
The head people.
But his God-entranced worldview, that holistic way of seeing everything in relation to God, had no successors. We fragmented the mind and the heart. We split them apart.
Piper shares his own testimony here. He says Edwards became his compass alongside the Bible. Not that Edwards has the authority of Scripture. Piper is very careful about that.
Very careful, yes.
But that he's a master of it. He is a guide who knows the terrain better than almost anyone.
And to explain the need for that guide, Piper uses a very compelling analogy to describe the modern condition of the church without this worldview. He calls it the 8-foot ceiling analogy.
I love this visual. It explains so much of the modern malaise in the church.
It does.
He describes modern congregants as people living in a room with an 8-foot white plaster ceiling and no windows.
They've never seen the blue sky. They've never seen the sun or the mountains. Their entire reality is contained within that small man-made box.
And the consequence is that they feel this sense of littleness and triviality in their souls, but they can't explain why. They're comfortable, perhaps, but they are small. Their world is small.
Because they have no grandeur. They are starved for the infinite. And Piper argues that the solution isn't more moral pep talks. It isn't psychological tips on garbage recycling or how to handle divorce.
Not that those things are bad.
No, not at all. They have their place. But what they fundamentally need, what the human soul craves, is the grandeur of God. They need someone to knock a hole in the ceiling.
This implies that everything from garage sales to demons, as Piper says, must be related to God's infinite greatness. If we don't see the connection, we are living under that 8-foot ceiling.
And this isn't just theoretical. This is where the rubber meets the road in pastoral ministry. This is where it gets very real. Piper shares a heart-wrenching story from his own ministry at Bethlehem Baptist that illustrates this perfectly.
The story of the abused child. This really drove the point home for me. It stops you in your tracks. Piper recounts that he had decided to preach on the holiness of God from Isaiah 6.
The holy, holy, holy passage.
Right, the passage where the seraphim are crying, "Holy, holy, holy," before the throne.
And significantly, I notes that he gave no practical application. He didn't offer 3 steps to a better Tuesday. He just spent the time unfolding the vision of God's majesty and holiness. He painted the picture of the king on the throne high and lifted up.
But practically speaking, there was a crisis in the pews that very week. A family had just discovered their child was being sexually abused by a relative.
A nightmare.
Police, social workers, doctors, the whole world had collapsed for them. It was the worst possible scenario.
Now pause there. Conventional wisdom and most seminary training would say that what that family needed on Sunday morning was a practical sermon.
Absolutely.
They needed a talk on coping mechanisms or healing from trauma or something immediately applicable to their pain. They needed empathy and utility.
True. If you were advising a pastor, you'd say, don't preach high theology today. People are hurting. Get down to earth. Meet them where they are.
But look at the result. The father told Piper later that the vision of God's holiness from that sermon was the rock they stood on during the devastation.
That's counterintuitive. It seems almost backward.
It is, but it's deeply true. A high view of God's sovereignty and holiness provides a stability that practical tips cannot offer. When your rung falls apart, when the floor drops out from under you, you don't need a tip.
You need an anchor.
You need a massive, unshakable God. You need to know that the one in charge is holy and powerful and that he hasn't lost control even when everything in your life feels out of control.
Piper mentions another example of a woman going through a divorce. She needed his stand and vision to survive spiritually. It seems like the God-entranced worldview isn't just for intellectuals, it's for survival.
It is the bedrock of pastoral care. It's the most practical thing a pastor can give. If you give people a small God, they have nowhere to stand when big problems hit. A small God cannot handle big trauma. Only a massive, sovereign God can anchor a soul in that kind of storm.
So if we accept that this worldview is essential, that we need to break the 8-foot ceiling, how do we get it? How do we cultivate that?
Well, that's the next step.
The source material shifts into 4 specific exhortations that Piper draws from Edwards' life. The first one is radical single-mindedness.
This takes us into Edwards' famous resolutions. As a young man, really just a teenager, he wrote 70 of them.
70.
And these weren't New Year's resolutions like I'll join a gym. These were binding contracts with himself before God about how he would live his entire life. Piper highlights resolution number 44 and number 61 specifically.
Okay, resolution 44 says, resolved that no other end but religion shall have any influence at all in any of my actions.
That's sweeping.
That is all-encompassing, no other end. And number 61 talks about refusing to give way to listlessness that relaxes the mind.
Listlessness. That's a great word. It's the drift. It's the feeling of scrolling through your phone for an hour because you can't be bothered to think. It's mental slouching.
Piper connects this single-mindedness to 2 Timothy chapter 2, the soldier, the athlete, the farmer.
Yes. The idea that a soldier on active duty doesn't get entangled in civilian pursuits.
He brings up the concept of a wartime versus peacetime mentality. I think a lot of us can relate to the peacetime description, especially in the modern West.
It's the danger of the ministry, or the Christian life in general, becoming just a job or a hobby. The wartime mentality shifts to a peacetime mentality. We start looking for a cushy lifestyle. We want comfort. We want to be entertained.
Piper describes it as evenings filled with harmless diversions, hobbies, and television. Just passing the time.
And to be clear, Piper isn't saying there's something inherently wrong with hobbies or rest. The issue is the center of gravity. What is the default mode?
It's about the intensity of focus.
Yes. Piper argues the church needs a God-besotted man. If the pastor, who is charged with knowing God, shifts into neutral and stops studying to pursue trivialities, the church becomes shallow.
He argues that if the leader stops climbing the mountain, the people won't see the view. They will be weak in the day of trial because their guide has stopped looking for the path.
And Edwards viewed theology as a science. He called it divinity. It wasn't just a side interest. It was the science of the eternal three-in-one, Jesus as mediator, and the work of the Spirit. It requires radical focus.
You cannot dabble in divinity and expect to be a great theologian.
Any more than you can dabble in physics and expect to be Einstein.
This leads directly into the second exhortation, labor to know the Scriptures.
This is about first-hand knowledge. This is so critical. Edwards didn't rely primarily on systems or commentaries. He went to the fountain. He wanted to know what God said, not what men said God said.
Piper even warns, don't even let Edwards or Packer be the primary source.
Which is ironic given the topic of the message, but the point is valid.
Go to the Bible itself.
Go to the source. And Edwards had a very specific physical method for this, the interleaved Bible.
I was fascinated by this description. It's such a tactile example of his dedication. Piper visited the Yale Library, where Edwards's unpublished works are stored.
And he saw this thing.
He saw this physical object. Edwards had taken a Bible apart.
Literally disassembled it. He took the binding off. Can you imagine?
He inserted a blank sheet of paper between every single page and then re-sewed it back together. So it was a page of Scripture, then a blank page, a page of Scripture, a blank page, all the way through.
Think about the effort that takes in the 18th century. And the intent. He then drew a line down the center of those blank pages to make columns for notes.
And the source says they were filled with tiny, almost illegible notes and reflections. Even in the remotest parts of Scripture. He wasn't just highlighting John 3.16. He was wrestling with Levitical law and genealogies.
This proves he was following his resolution number 28, to study Scripture so steadily, constantly, and frequently that he could perceive his own growth in knowledge.
He wanted to see the progress. He wanted to know he was getting somewhere.
It wasn't just a duty, it was a conquest. He wanted to gain ground.
That's a challenge to modern believers. I have to ask myself, do I have a plan for understanding the terrain of Scripture like that? Do I have a map?
Most of us read for a pick-me-up. We want a nugget for the day, something to make us feel better. Or a pastor reads to get a sermon idea because Sunday is coming.
Right, it's utilitarian.
Edwards read to understand the sequence of thought of God. He wanted to gain new ground daily. It's a completely different orientation toward the text.
It's the difference between snacking and mining. Snacking is easy. Mining is hard labor.
Spot on. And that mining requires time, which brings us to the third exhortation, redeem the time.
This is where we talk about activity versus passivity. Resolution number 6 says, live with all my might while I live.
All my might.
That sounds like something you'd see on a motivational poster, but Edwards actually did it.
And resolution number 11 is even more specific. When a theological problem arises, solve it immediately if possible.
Immediately. That's the kicker. Not, I'll get to it later. Not, I'll put it on my to-do list.
No. Piper contrasts this with passive reading, which he likens to watching TV.
That's a great comparison.
When we read passively, we let the words wash over us. We read a paragraph and realize we have no idea what it said. We don't ask, why does this sentence follow that one? What's the logical connection? Edwards advocated for active reading.
Reading to solve problems.
Reading like a detective on a case.
And he had a tool for this too. Pen in hand.
Always. He never read without it.
Piper details that Edwards always read with a pen. Why? To write down trains of thought. To trace arguments.
There's a cognitive benefit here that is crucial. You cannot sustain a long sequence of logical questions and answers in your head without writing them down. Your working memory just isn't big enough.
It gets away from you.
The writing molds the person into a thinking being. If you don't write it, you lose the thread, you lose the insight, you can't build on it.
There's a great anecdote about him thinking while riding a horse.
Yes, Sereno Dwight, his biographer, tells this. Edwards would often ride into the woods for exercise and contemplation. If a thought came to him while writing, he didn't have a notebook handy.
So what did he do?
He would pin a small piece of paper to his coat to remind him of that specific insight until he got home.
He would literally pin it to himself.
Yes. He might arrive home with his coat covered in scraps of paper, flapping in the wind, each one a thought he refused to lose.
That is dedication.
It is. It shows he valued those thoughts more than his appearance or his convenience. He treated thoughts about God as precious jewels that he couldn't afford to drop.
His schedule was grueling. Up to 13 hours a day in the study.
13 hours!
And he even regulated his diet based on his study.
He observed which foods made him sleepy or dull and avoided them. If his mind was in a good frame for contemplation, he would skip dinner rather than be interrupted. He chose the spiritual feast over the physical one.
And he rose early, motivated by the fact that Christ rose from the grave early. The discipline was total.
Now, Piper adds a caveat here, and I think it's important. We have to be careful. Edwards might have been wrong in some of his pastoral choices.
Okay.
He didn't visit people in their homes unless called for. He spent a massive amount of time in isolation, which eventually contributed to him being dismissed from his church.
Right. Piper isn't saying ignore your throck and starve yourself.
No, he is not saying copy his schedule. That's not the point. But the lesson is the intensity of the focus, the willingness to discipline the body and the schedule for the sake of knowing God. Are we willing to be even half that disciplined?
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most beautiful exhortation. Logic on fire.
This is the Puritan ideal. This ties everything together. It's the marriage of reason and affection. It's the answer to those who say, don't give me theology, just give me Jesus.
Edwards would say you can't have one without the other.
Right.
The goal of study isn't just to be smart. It's not about winning arguments or passing exams. It's for heartfelt worship and practical obedience.
And to get there, Edwards makes a vital distinction between speculative reason and true sense. This is the key to understanding his entire ministry, his entire thought process.
Okay, break that down. Speculative reason.
Speculative reason can convince you that God is holy. You can win the argument. You can prove it from the text. You can pass the theology exam. You know it as a fact.
But that's not enough.
It's not enough. You need what he calls a sensible discovery of the beauty of that holiness. You have to not just know it's true, but feel that it's beautiful.
The analogy Edwards uses is honey.
Yes,
Yeah.
It's the classic illustration. There's a difference between believing that honey is sweet because someone told you or because you analyzed its chemical composition in a lab.
That's speculative reason.
And actually tasting the sweetness on your tongue.
Tasting is the true sense.
Exactly. And Edwards argues that without that delight, without that relishing, knowledge is no better than what the devils have. The demons know God is holy. They know the Bible better than we do. They tremble. But they don't taste the beauty of it. They hate the holiness they see. We are called to love it, to delight in it.
This connects directly to the concept of Christian hedonism, which is something Piper is famous for, but he draws it straight from Edwards.
It's the ultimate purpose of theology. God is glorified not most by being known or obeyed dutifully, but by being enjoyed.
The quote is powerful. God is glorified not only by his glories being seen, but by its being rejoiced in.
God communicates his glory to the mind and the heart. If it stops at the mind, God is not fully glorified in us. It has to reach the heart. It has to result in joy. If your theology doesn't lead to doxology, to worship, it's defective.
Piper concludes this section with a beautiful series of metaphors. God is the substance. Families and friends are shadows.
God is the sun. Earthly joys are scattered beams.
God is the ocean. Earthly pleasures are streams.
It's a radical reorientation of everything. The pastor, the theologian, the learner, you must seek to glorify God by enjoying him forever. That's the engine that drives the study, the discipline, and the missions. We study because we want to see more of the one we love.
So bringing this all together, it's a lot to take in. We've looked at the caricature versus the reality moving past the angry spider to the God-entranced pastor. We've seen the missionary legacy born out of the tragedy of David Brainerd. We've discussed the desperate need for a God-entranced worldview to handle life's tragedies like abuse and divorce.
The 8-foot ceiling.
And we've walked through the exhortations, single-mindedness, knowing the scriptures firsthand, redeeming the time, and logic on fire.
It's a comprehensive challenge. Edwards challenges us to abandon triviality. He calls us to pursue a massive, holy, and sovereign God. He calls us to break that 8-foot ceiling and see the sky.
And as we said at the beginning, this isn't just for pastors. This is for any learner who wants to know God. Whether you're an engineer, a teacher, a stay-at-home parent, or a student, the call to a God-entranced worldview stands.
Indeed, it's about waking up from the peacetime mentality and realizing the magnitude of the God we profess to believe in. It's about being fully alive to his glory in every part of our lives.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, derived from Edwards' pen-in-hand habit. We talked about him pinning papers to his coat so he wouldn't lose a thought about God.
It's a striking image, it really is.
So here's the question for you today. If you were to pin a piece of paper to your coat today, representing a thought about God you don't want to lose, what would that thought be? What is the insight or the attribute of God that you are afraid of forgetting in the rush of your daily life?
That is worth contemplating.
Until next time, keep thinking.